Okay. Thank you, Akinyi, for being here, and for all of you to being here for the launch of our new iteration of ways in which we support nonprofits and leaders across the country. We're super excited to have today Akinyi Ochieng, who is, I think you probably all read her biography, but she's a director and vice president at APCO Worldwide. And she advises leading corporations, foundations, and nonprofits on their social impact initiatives. She's got a ton of experience in all aspects of that. But today she's going to focus for us on strategic planning, especially in times of uncertainty like we find ourselves in at the moment. We are hoping that this is a very engaging, interactive type of a session. Please jump in. I will monitor the chat to see if there is anyone who has a question or whatever. So you don't need to do that, Akinyi, but also let's proceed by raising hands and having a very free-flowing conversation after Akinyi gets started. And Akinyi also, just because at Yana we like to talk about Yale affiliation.
Yeah.
She has her bachelor's degree from Yale and her master's in global politics from LSE, where one of my friends taught. So anyhow, with no further ado, I'm going to turn myself on mute and look forward to your comments. Okay.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Lisa, Rachel, and the Yana community for having me join you. Really excited to deliver today's conversation. And, strategic planning is a huge, expansive topic that you can tackle in many directions. And today, I'm going to talk about how do you make sure that your plan is responsive to the needs of your beneficiaries or partners on the ground, knowing that, in this time of a lot of volatility, that's more important than ever, that we're listening carefully and making sure that the plans that are being adopted and built in boardrooms are responsive to needs. I have slides because I am a consultant. So, I always find a visual aid to be very helpful, but my hope really is that this is very conversational. I don't want this to be overly formal, and I'll try to keep this probably to no more than 30 minutes of presentation. And then I will try and pull down the slides and open it up for questions, but please, as we go through, feel free to throw things in the chat and we'll address it in that way. I also will say, as I go through slides, there are a couple of moments where I'd love to invite you all to chime in, ask questions, give comments in the chat, and also invite folks in the room to share their perspective on what they've seen to be an effective approach. As Lisa mentioned in my bio, I have the pleasure of serving as a director and vice president of a firm called APCO. We're an advisory consultancy that helps leaders build what we call the uncommon ground where progress is made. And we say that because common ground feels rare these days. And it's important to kind of get folks on all different sides to come along in the journey to create progress. My clients largely draw from the public, private, nonprofit sector, all broadly speaking, trying to accelerate the pace of social progress. But outside of my work, my day-to-day work, I also serve on a number of boards. And so I come to you tonight as someone who has been on both sides of the table, both having worked with nonprofits, advised nonprofits, but also been the board member trying to make sense of it all. And so I hope that both of those, I guess all three of those perspectives are helpful to you all. So let me just go to the next slide. So I have a couple of learning goals for us today. The first is, what does strategic planning look like in a nonprofit context, which looks very different from how you might approach it for a for-profit, which obviously might go without saying. And the second is, why is it important to design with the community perspective in mind? So in terms of today's agenda, broadly speaking, we'll talk about how do you understand your stakeholders and make sense of them, making sure that you're being narrow enough that you can develop targeted programs, but expansive enough that you're thinking about them holistically as whole people. How do you design a responsive strategic planning framework? And then lastly, how do you get buy-in? How do you socialize a plan throughout an organization from top to bottom? So my hope is that by the end of this, we'll have a robust conversation about those three dimensions. So I'm just curious to get a sense of folks in the room, if you could just pop in the chat or, come off mute if you prefer. On a scale of 1 to 5, how confident are you that your organization's strategic plan reflects what your ultimate community stakeholders actually need? And again, if anyone wants to pop in the chat or speak up, okay, we got a 3. Anyone else? Okay, one more. And I'd say like most organizations that I work with are probably in that 3 or 4. It's very rare that someone will get a 5, unless you're perhaps the most well-resourced organization, you have a constant kind of feedback mechanism. And so my hope is that in today's conversation, I'll give you some ways of thinking about how to make sure that you get closer to that 5, recognizing that that 5 is somewhat rare. So, first of all, how do you understand your stakeholders? So to quote the National Council on Nonprofits, and everyone on this call is very familiar with this, but goes without saying, charitable nonprofits, they embody the best of America's collective spirit of service and compassion. They transform shared values and aspirations into meaningful action. They create tangible change in communities nationwide. And this country has over 1.3 million organizations that provide essential services. They feed, they heal, they shelter, educate, nurture people in all demographics, in all regions. But to ensure your work genuinely reflects community needs, my belief is that you have to focus on these three critical approaches. And the first is defining your audience with some degree of precision. And that starts with expanding your vision beyond immediate service recipients to identify all stakeholders who can benefit from your impact, whether that's indirect or direct. It's important to, as you do that, map the ecosystem of constituent groups with their distinct needs, their motivations, their engagement patterns in particular, and then to really articulate the primary beneficiaries versus those secondary stakeholders so you can think about how you allocate resources. I'm speaking in generalities, but I'll come to giving you an example of what it might look like if you shift perspective to thinking in this way. But before I come to that, I just want to go to the second pillar, which is looking at the complexity, the full complexity of the people you serve. It's important to have a really good understanding of the segments, whether that's demographic, geographic, psychographic, or other behavioral factors that could influence your ultimate service delivery. And to look holistically at how various life circumstances might impact an individual's ability to engage with your services. And then lastly, just focusing on this idea of expanding your perspective for inclusive impact. So how can you look to actively incorporate historically underrepresented and marginalized voices to inform that program design and evaluation? And then look at forward-looking strategies that anticipate, how demographics are going to shift or how community needs might evolve. And that last pillar, is particularly in this moment where a lot is in flux, is more important than ever. So I want to give you an example of what it might look like to go from a more traditional view of how you might think of your stakeholders to what it looked like if you take that more expansive perspective that I've just outlined. So, for example, a more traditional view might say, to use a food bank, something that I think most of us are probably familiar with. A food bank might just define its beneficiaries as being food secure individuals who receive meals. That's the most, basic traditional definition. But if we're taking those 3 frameworks in mind, we might look at that differently. So if we're defining that audience with precision, we're thinking about beyond those immediate meal recipients, how might we look at about people who gain financial flexibility when our food costs are reduced? So we could recognize multiple groups within that. It could be seniors who have mobility limitations, who might be food insecure as a result, working families who might need supplemental assistance, unhoused people who have distinct needs. If we move then to that kind of embracing complexity, okay, how do we think about people who might have specialty diets or think about culturally appropriate foods or cooking facilities and their ability to actually cook what we're the resources that we're providing? And then, looking at that whole person context, can we think about people, can you create personas of sorts? Within your stakeholder population, are there single mothers who might be working multiple jobs or need different distribution times than your homebound senior? And then lastly, if we take that expansive perspective, might we consider, if we look at, how do we incorporate those diverse voices, diverse views? Might we think about including immigrant communities who might avoid services because they might be concerned about documentation? That's something that obviously in today's climate would be top of mind for someone who might be running a food bank. How might we think about seasonal workers whose needs fluctuate throughout the year in terms of their levels of food insecurity? And then lastly, how do you build relationships with community leaders to make your distribution model more effective? And so I just wanted to give you an example of what it might look like to take that more expansive view in practice. And that, if you took that view, it might lead you to do a bunch of different things differently programmatically. And also, obviously, at the strategic planning level in terms of how you're allocating resources and how your program is structured. So that might look like expanded hours. If we're to carry this food bank example forward, it might look like mobile distribution, culturally diverse food options, wraparound services, something that wouldn't necessarily emerge if you took that really simple traditional definition of what it looks like to have a food bank. And also, it might even look like redefining your mission. So, should it shift from, in this example, providing meals to instead creating food security and dignity? That is a more powerful, inclusive positioning of that work. So next, I just want to transition and talk about, what are successful beneficiary, if you use that term, or stakeholder feedback models that you all might have seen work well. And I'm curious if anyone wants to pop anything in the chat, but I can certainly speak to a few. So some of the strategies that I like to deploy in my work, some of them are just structured listening sessions. And in doing those listening sessions, of course, it's important to have people who are trained to facilitate well. I think sometimes the bias is to hire outside facilitators. And while if you have the resources, I think that's best. But if you don't, there's targeted training programs that you can pursue to kind of build those skills. So the structured listening sessions that create safe spaces to have conversations around what are the needs. And as you do those sessions, it's important to consider things like, people's means and ability to participate. And if you have the bandwidth or the budget, thinking about things like meals or childcare, transportation to enable the widest breadth of people to participate. There are also digital solutions, of course. People are very used to text surveys or QR codes to capture that feedback and paying attention to the response, the anticipated response time to complete those kind of surveys and digital engagement tools. One approach that I've seen be particularly effective is to create a kind of community advisory board of sorts that ensures that your beneficiaries or your stakeholders directly influence organizational decisions. And so, as much as you have a board of directors providing checks and balances on your strategic planning, to also get the community to validate that. So it's both top down, but bottom up as well. And then lastly, thinking about, how can you embed collection models within your ways of working? So whether it's kind of trying to create temperature checks in your service interactions so that you are getting the full breadth of perspectives. That's particularly important if you might be working with populations that are very time constrained or might have literacy barriers in particular. And I see some folks said on-site observation and interviewing, absolutely. And I think that's that temperature check model I was speaking to. Employee surveys definitely important so that you're not only, kind of in the boardroom deciding what should happen as you're in a strategic planning process, but you're also incorporating the perspective of those that are most proximate to your community members. Next, I want to turn to some common barriers that we see when it comes to understanding stakeholder needs. And this, I can circulate this deck afterwards, but this is just kind of a summary of some of the things that I spoke to in terms of useful methods. So there are common barriers that I kind of group others might approach this differently, into these buckets. So there's the structural barriers, the data collection barriers, and the organizational needs. As you think about embarking on strategic planning and think about adopting a process that allows you to be a little bit more proximate to the end beneficiaries of this work, it's important to consider the dynamics as relates to these barriers. On the structural side, there might be power dynamics that inhibit honest feedback. If someone is seen from coming from a kind of high status background, interviewing someone from a low status background, how might that shape what that person might tell you? Obviously, language and accessibility barriers and feedback collection are always a challenge. There also might be resource constraints limiting more comprehensive research. And I've certainly been in this position, as I imagine that you all have been, in terms of both the time required and also the resources if you're deploying more sophisticated surveying tools to get those insights. So it's often important to think about, how can you adapt to, what you have? Do you have the time and the resources to do in-depth interviews? Is a focus group more effective? Can you do a survey? What survey instruments might you have that enable you to cut that data in different ways and analyze it effectively to inform your service delivery? Those are tricky things to navigate. In that data collection bucket, of course, there's survey fatigue. We find this to be particularly true amongst frequently researched populations. I started my career working in the agricultural sector in Africa, working with women's farmers groups. And one of the things I regularly heard from the communities I worked with is, we have different development agencies, different nonprofits who are coming and asking us different questions, and we're tired of answering these questions. And so it's important to think about, as you are asking a community a question to inform, what you do, are there other ways that you might gain this data? Or how can you address that survey fatigue, whether it's incentivizing participation or looking towards novel, kind of low time burden, for lack of a better term, ways of collecting that information. On the data collection point as well, there's always this concern around representativeness, making sure that you're not just hearing those segments that are most likely to be vocal, but that you're really taking a broad view of who in the community you should and could be bringing into your process. And lastly, this dynamic of, you want to go broad and get that big picture, but it's also important to get that granularity. And I think that comes from those individual stories. So I always recommend, where possible, to consider doing those in-depth interviews with folks to get a better picture of, what does that broad statistic look like at the most individual level. And then lastly, there's some organizational constraints to help to how we understand stakeholders. I find this to be particularly true for organizations that perhaps are older, or maybe the dominant player in a space, whether you're one of the only nonprofits in town, or you have a deep history working in a particular community. You might think that this community better than everyone else, and you're right. But it's important to check that confirmation bias because needs evolve over time. There's the second one is quite interesting under this third bucket, the idea of fear of negative feedback creating resistance. And you often find this particularly when maybe mid-level people are leading work, or you have a leader at the top who's organizing a review that they think might have an impact on how the board might see them. So kind of setting on the outset that we anticipate that we might hear things that are not great about how we work or operate, and that the intention of this is to improve upon that baseline. I think that setting those that tone from the top and that value is important, because often you don't want people to hide information, obscure information, because they feel that it will negatively impact their job, but rather that this process is in service of being of service, of providing the best service to community. And lastly, this is so important. There's nothing worse than a report that is created or a strategic plan that's created that sits on the shelf. And so as you think about starting planning, how do you think about the other side of that? What does it look like to translate feedback into actionable insights? And as you embark on a planning process, thinking about what is the other side of that and what is the implementation roadmap going to look like, and baking that into timeline, and thinking about how that also impacts your not only your accountability, but your license to operate in a community. So lastly, I want to talk about, what does it look like to design a more responsive strategic framework? So, sorry, give me one second. Okay. So part of it is about obviously incorporating strategic stakeholder feedback into your planning cycles, which we've discussed. Creating measurable objectives that are tied to stakeholder outcomes, because your legitimacy to operate comes from your community and meeting your community's needs. So how do you build in those objectives that tie to meaningful progress on those kind of indicators? And also acknowledging that there's going to need to be flexibility. As you build this ambitious 5-year plan, for example, what are the 1-year or 3-year check marks that you can have to figure out, okay, how do we need to pivot based on what we're learning and how the needs of the community are evolving? Before I get into this case study, I just want to pause and talk about the importance of getting buy-in, because without broad engagement from every level of organization, you miss really practical knowledge from those that are closest to the work, who can identify implementation challenges before they can become roadblocks. And plans that are composed or imposed without socialization, those create compliance challenges, and they don't generate the real buy-in that you need to have a sustained effort through the inevitable challenges that come with rolling out a planning framework. As I'm sure that many people on this call have experienced, people naturally resist change when they don't understand it and they don't feel they were consulted. And that leads to resistance, it leads to workarounds, it leads to just abandonment of a plan. It leads to silos when they aren't socialized. It can prevent cross-functional solutions, and it also can hinder innovation. And so that's why I want to spend some time on this before we open up to just questions and conversation, because I find that without that organization-wide alignment from the top to the bottom, that departments implement changes in ways that optimize maybe for their units metrics, but without considering the broad impact on the organization as a whole. So it's about that balance between that top down and bottom up. That top down communication is about, okay, how do you ensure strategic vision and priorities are consistently understood? But those bottom up challenges channels rather are equally important, because you have to capture, I think someone had put in the chat earlier, you have to capture that frontline insight about the implementation challenges that might come with your big lofty idea and the unintended consequences as well. And so to do that effectively, you have to connect the plan to the organizational mission and values, not just the metrics. You have to tailor messaging to what each level cares about, looking at not only the strategic impact for executives, but also, what does it look like for the staff who's actually going to have to implement this? And then also think about creating those continuous feedback loops that flow upward, and how you track that those suggestions and concerns are being considered, and in some cases, not all, being implemented. Because again, to the point of, there's nothing worse than a strategic plan that sits on a shelf that isn't fully implemented. Equally bad is, suggestions from staff when you go on a listening tour that aren't really considered. And so it's important to think about the channels for that feedback and how they're implemented, and also thinking about touch points throughout that implementation to share progress and evolve those insights. I'm going to skip ahead, actually, in the interest of time, but I think I'll pause here. But some different strategies that you can take for each level as you embark on that socialization journey. So for frontline staff, just some things that come to mind: involve them early in identifying challenges that the plan could address. Share concrete examples of how changes will improve their daily experience. Provide trainings that are focused on application rather than just theory. So actually working through different scenarios, like what if XYZ happened? How might you implement that based on the new framework or the new plan? And then also recognize and celebrate those early adopters who are modeling what you would like everyone else to do. Kind of at the next level, thinking about middle management really as the connectors. So equipping them with information and giving them time to process and give you feedback on how their teams will respond to it before you communicate downward. One practice I've found to be really helpful is to think about creating peer learning communities among managers to share, what's working from a socialization perspective, to kind of workshop best practices, and develop those two-way communication tools. And then lastly, to create ownership across all levels, some things that I've found to be effective, identifying champions across departments who can influence their peers, thinking about cross-functional implementation teams that have representation from different parts of the organization. And lastly, documenting and sharing the success stories. To my earlier point of how do you recognize and celebrate those early adopters, codify them, elevate them, and that will build momentum and inspire others to follow their lead. So I will just touch on one more thing and then probably open up for questions because time is flying by faster than I thought. But some common barriers I've seen in terms of organization-wide adoption, obviously resource constraints, inadequate time, staffing, or funding around implementation. So as you think about embarking on a planning process, thinking about slowing it down so you can speed up. Because if you move too quickly, then you sometimes shortchange that implementation planning. The second thing is thinking about the sequencing and also the timing of it. Change fatigue is real. And I think change fatigue at a moment in which the nonprofit sector is under a lot of stress and duress is important to consider. And so how do you make sure that your staff are not overwhelmed by concurrent initiatives, but that the sequencing of this is aligned to other things that are happening in the organization? Important, but not, in my opinion, not talked enough about is skills gaps. So how do you make sure your staff have the necessary training and expertise to execute new approaches? Most nonprofits do not have the budget to send their staff on, expensive training programs. But where can you find moments for them to do peer learning, whether it's connecting them to other organizations that might be doing work in similar geographies or in the sector where they can exchange best practices? How can you find internal and external mentors for your team so they feel that they have the support to implement that new vision? And then also thinking about, how do your performance metrics align with the new vision of the organization to ensure that the incentives are aligned for people to make change? And then lastly, I'll conclude by saying, there's different practical solutions that you can make for different contexts. If you're resource constrained, starting with small pilot projects that can demonstrate the value of something before scaling. If you're geographically dispersed, in today's remote first world, thinking about what might it mean to create a digital community of practice to model what good looks like. If your structure is particularly hierarchical, you might think about how do you identify and empower informal leaders who can influence their peers. And then if you're fast paced and you think that this might, give people whiplash, thinking about breaking down the implementation roadmap into smaller sprints that have milestones that allow for regular reflection. And then lastly, I think for very, very mission driven organizations, which I think many nonprofits, ideally most nonprofits are, it's important to frame those changes in terms of how they will impact the communities that you seek to serve, not just about operational efficiency. And the way to know that you're having an impact is to look for early signs of successful adoption. That could look like training completion or staff engagement scores. Think about creating process metrics. So looking at how consistently those new approaches are being implemented across teams, looking at outcome metrics. So, are there tangible improvements in your service delivery, in your beneficiary or stakeholder feedback, in the efficiency of your operations? And then lastly, are you seeing an impact in terms of organizational health, whether it's staff retention or cross-functional collaboration, or different measures? So I want to pause there and just open up by asking a question to everyone, which is, I hope that today's session, first of all, was helpful. But secondly, wondering if there's a specific action that you might take to make your planning more responsive to the needs of your stakeholders, just based on some of what we've discussed today.
I can pause.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to say thank you very much. I became executive director of a nonprofit about 8 months ago that the organization has been around for 20 something years, but has never had a strategic plan, which is sort of anathema to the way that I work. But in coming in, also recognize the need to be circumspect before introducing strategic planning. And so I've really been trying to figure out how best to do that. And I think there is actually a lot of receptivity and desire for it. But your emphasis on, different ways to engage stakeholders definitely resonates with the ways that we've been thinking and sort of sharpens our thinking a bit. So very grateful.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm glad it was helpful.
Oh. Edward's note taker is sending us a message. Thank you so much, Akinyi. This is a lot of really valuable information in a really condensed way. And I'm sure we can get a copy of your PowerPoint just so we can refer back to those, to the, so the overall structure, and then think about all of the different ways in which you have, given us some thoughts about that. I'm wondering if anybody in the group has tried or has really created their strategic plan with their ultimate beneficiaries in mind, and what the results of that were. I know in the organization for which I worked for almost 2 decades, there was definitely fatigue about flavor of the month because we were constantly trying to figure out a different way of explaining our very intersectional approach to the work. And I know that's a real risk, especially if you engage very actively. It's like the opposite to what Sonda just was talking about. If you engage too much in strategic planning, then you get that as well. And we do have a question in the chat about building on that food bank example. Can you give a strategy for how you could use to empower recipients who have food insecurity? So, it's about getting that input and feedback. It's about being close enough. It's about having lived experience in your advisory system. And yet, is there a like a really concrete example you could cite?
I would say, I think that I've even seen this in one of the food banks that I work with, and I volunteer at in Brooklyn. So this is not someone I support, an organization I support as a client, but as someone who is a volunteer. And one of the things that we did was to ask recipients. We had someone who would literally just stand near the door and ask recipients for feedback on like what foods that they, what they enjoyed, what they wished that was there, and then making sure that was cascaded to the top, so that it wasn't just us collecting food from, the donor organizations and just hoping that someone took it, but rather that we were working with organizations that met the needs of those ultimate beneficiaries, if that makes sense. So I think actually just asking people, it's sometimes as simple as that, but also creating that feedback loop so that that feedback is cascaded up to shift, in this case, who the partners were. So the partners were responsive to the needs of the community rather than just getting partners and then kind of giving the community.
Sonda, your the background that creating noise. Perfect. Thank you. I don't know if you were finished, Akinyi, or not.
Oh, no, that was it on that point.
I think you're raising a really important point, which is one of the ways in which we can be most effective is by identifying partners and not trying to do everything ourselves, especially if you're focused on intersectionality, which I already caught to being. We have 2 questions or 2 parts of one question, Philip, in the chat here that says how to effectively confront pockets of vested interests and silos. I'm assuming that's within an organization, but Philip, you might want to pop in here, or argument that we will tackle this ourselves at some point. And then secondly, exploring the range of stakeholder interests can be expansive and can yield ideas for new initiatives outside the current organization.
So on confronting those vested interests, that is both the biggest challenge, but actually one of the parts of my job that I enjoy the most, because it's, how do you bring people along in the journey? Part of that, I think, is about really clearly identifying, and ideally in a strategic planning process, you have a stakeholder map and you're identifying, who are the people you're going to co-create with, who are going to be the detractors, who are going to be the advocates and evangelists, and getting in front of those people early to make them feel bought in on the process when you're really divergent before you converge on what you want to do, and getting ahead of what is going to make them, dismiss an idea by either coming at it, for example, by validating with data. That often is the best defense if people are a detractor. Come with them with, this is what the data says and how it contrasts to maybe your opinion of something. And also getting to the bottom of, what is the root of the detraction? Is it that, they have an outdated view? Is it that there's a personal vested interest in something? There's, maybe a fear factor about how their role is evolving. So I found those to be effective strategies in kind of dealing with those vested interests to identify who they are early, engage them at the outset, so you kind of mitigate what is to come down the road.
So that raises a question I think many of us have had over time, and that is strategic planning needs to be intentional and it needs to take its time, but it also can't take forever.
Yes.
So how do you balance that dynamic tension to be able to do the things you've just described, and and identifying and finding your detractors and your advocates, and at the same time not creating a situation in which you're working for years on something, and by the time you're done with it, it's obsolete. Yeah.
I mean, I think one of the things that, so I started out in nonprofits. I went to the for-profit sector, and then now I'm a consultant to nonprofits. But one of the things that I have really borrowed from my experience working in the tech sector is user research and thinking about things in terms of personas. And so I think that when you group your stakeholders according to personas, it makes it easier to identify, like, what is the minimum number of people I need to get signal according to different persona groups. And if you have a very clear idea in your mind of the different personas or stakeholder groups that you're trying to reach, and kind of what their interests are. I mean, I quite literally sometimes will sketch out, you have architect A, these are her interests, these are her concerns, these are her challenges, these are the questions that she has, and then figuring out, okay, what 2 to 3 people fit within that persona that help me like hit off the points that I'm trying to understand. And that makes it so that you get a perspective that is mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive, that really hits those main points. Because you're right, you can't interview everyone endlessly. You can't be drowning in data, but making sure that you at least have kind of just that necessary but sufficient level of signal. And I think there's no perfect answer, there's just signal, is helpful in terms of the planning process.
We have another question here, which is, can you talk about best practice in terms of metrics for tracking implementation and impact of strategic plans? Or is it, Sarah, did you mean of strategic plans or of the whole organization's work?
No, actually, I meant the strategic plan, but I mean, the strategic plan should reflect the organization's work, I think. But a lot of times,
Sure.
I don't want to say a lot of times, but I have seen this problem in some nonprofits that you spend time making a strategic plan and then it sits on a shelf and there's no tracking of implementing it. It doesn't really change how you set up your structure. And then 3-4 years later, everybody's sort of wondering why we did that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And and everybody always asks for metrics. There's always this like metrics. And, I have some basic ideas, but do you have some guidelines about the things that really do work and that inspire people to, to make these things actually live?
I guess, I don't know if I have a very satisfactory answer to that one, but I would say, because it's challenging. I think it's challenging for everyone. I mean, I would say that to make sure that that metric is aspirational, to make sure that it is something that is tangible, and to make sure that it is something that's measurable. and not like overly complex to measure, especially if you're in a resource constrained environment. So I think that it's important to consider, as you identify what that metric is, how feasible is it actually to get that data? Because I think sometimes it's easy to focus on data that, like, maybe, for example, it might be mandated down from a funder, but actually practically for you would be resource intensive or quite challenging to get, and actually doesn't tell you anything you need to do to your job. So I know that's not the most satisfactory answer, but I guess I think about in terms of the principles of what you want to achieve.
I have an additional comment, if I may. I'm not the expert, but I will say in our experience, what we did was we had an overall strategic plan, and then we had annual goals that flowed down from that plan, and they were actually presented to the board every quarter. And so in the spirit of we do what we measure, that was a process that worked. Now, in terms of identifying what those metrics are, which is really more what you were just talking about, really challenging to move, for example, from output to outcome, right? It's pretty easy to, hopefully, to measure that, you serve 500 people, but it's a lot harder to say you move them from poverty to a livable wage kind of thing. Sarah's got her thumb up. Okay. But
no, I'm just saying thank you to you both. That's actually that is very helpful. I agree. Yeah.
Well, so Lisa, I love that. I love that point, because I think you more eloquently articulated what I was trying to get to. I mean, ideally, you want to be outcomes based. We all do, but it's really challenging to do that. And I think sometimes I find it effective to look at different data sets out there. I mean, it depends on the kind of intervention you're doing. I think in some cases it would only work depending on the level, the scale of the work you're doing. But one index I really like is the Economic Innovation Group has what they call the Distress Communities Index, and it looks at the county level at different variables of economic insecurity. And so one organization I was working with chose to use that index to kind of look at, over a period of time, was it meaningfully moving the needle in certain communities that it was working with? Was there a variety of those kind of indices? PolicyLink, for example, has I'm going to get the name wrong. I think it's called the Racial Equity Atlas, is another measure. So I would also think about, where can you, as you think about outcomes, look at other indices that might help you think about, how are you creating an impact in a particular community? I'm curious, like, Lisa, it was helpful to hear you share your example of what you've seen work in your work. Are there other examples of strategies or approaches that others have taken that they found to be particularly effective, or also lessons learned from what hasn't worked?
anyone can. Oh, good, Justin. Yes, please share.
Well, I just was, first of all, thank you for the presentation. It was great. I couldn't jump on camera until just now, but this is not so much, I'm kind of opening the aperture a bit here, because I was struck by what you were saying around the importance of really understanding your audiences and understanding your stakeholders, and going through the process of getting that deep understanding of demographic and psychographic and geographic and all of that. My background is brand strategy, and I work with nonprofits and foundations and companies as well. And I find that the work I do dovetails really nicely with strategic planning processes. You go through all of this deep work and ask a lot of deep questions, and it really gets to questions of identity. What's our purpose? What are we here to do? Who do we serve? All of those are brand questions and end up needing to be expressed through messaging and outward facing vehicles. And so for those of us on the call, I heard someone say they were going to embark on a strategic planning process. I would just offer that you're getting brand strategy value also when you do this work. We talked a lot about the operational programmatic and operational piece, and that value. But, I can take insights that have been generated in the strategic planning process and pull those directly into my brand strategy work. And to the extent that you can use the stakeholders' own language, that really helps you to get at powerful value propositions and other things down the line. So again, it is an investment of time. I know strategic planning is
Yes.
not, for the faint of heart, but just in word of encouragement and just additional value that you can gain from going through a thorough process, there is that brand strategy upside.
Jason, I think that is a brilliant comment and definitely would underscore that. And that if you can get insights from your stakeholders in their own words, that has tremendous value because it helps you understand, what will resonate with them. And also, what is your unique story to tell? So just +1 to that.
I was just, if it's okay, since I'm not stepping into the silence here, but I was just thinking as we were talking that I do have another example from our organization about stakeholder input and how that has an impact on metrics. So not so much in terms of strategic planning, but in terms of metrics. So we engaged in this process and we decided to ask our participants what defines success for them. And so we had 5 domains and one of them was education. So we made this scale, is 1 to 5 scale. Where are you on education? And when we brought that back for the second round to our participants, they said a PhD isn't success for education for me. And it really reminded us, then at that point that, even within the outcomes that they had defined, that we were overlaying, our own value system. And so we redefined it again to say, okay, 1 to 5, whatever that means for you, right? It makes it harder to quantify and, kind of report out on outcomes, but it certainly made it more responsive to what the participants' needs were. I was just thinking about that in terms of your question, Sarah. And it is a way of getting feedback back from your stakeholders. So, I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions or comments if people have them. I'll stay quiet for a minute.
This is a difficult one. I'm just reading your question, Philip.
I'll read it out loud while you're reading. Would love to have the talent to convince everybody, but without that skill, what can be expected, perhaps even demanded, in terms of detailed arguments from naysayers who are challenging a strategic plan proposal?
It is challenging. I mean, I think it is also, I think embedded in your question is an observation that there are some people that no matter what you do, you're not going to bring them along, right? And so it's, I think, acknowledging that reality that you will not always be successful, but also trying to, as much as you possibly can, anticipate those arguments and get ahead of them. And also, convince others of the validity of them. I know that's probably not the most satisfying answer, but I think that's where I think data is your friend. Also rooting it in, particularly data that roots it in the needs of the community in their own words. I found in the past, when I've actually done sometimes videos when people are open to it, but videos to be convincing. When you hear someone say it in their own words, it's hard to deny that this is the very valid need. Quotes from interviews often tend to be also effective. Just kind of show people that perhaps your perspective is the outlier here rather than the norm. It's a very polite way to kind of just put those naysayers to the side.
Those are very helpful suggestions. Thank you so much.
Good question.
Of course.
We are just starting to put together a strategic plan, a relatively new organization. And I'm wondering, in terms of the stakeholders within our organization, you know, including advisors and things like that, you know, who should be part of the process, and how do we include people? You know, we've got leadership, but then we've got, well, we have unpaid, everybody's unpaid right now. You know, but there's still these sort of levels like leadership and staff, and we need buy-in. So anyway, where are those lines, and how do we do that?
I think at first it starts with understanding whose approval is real, like who is going to need to approve this for this to get done. I think that's first, like being very clear on, is it the board, to what level of buy-in do you need from executive team, and which people on the executive team. I think that dynamic is first very important to understand. You know, can you have a small working group that is the ultimate decider, that is a mix of perhaps those stakeholders. But I think to your point of how do you ensure that you know, that middle management, that those frontline staff are involved, on figuring out, you know, where are the nodes of influence in your organization? Who are the employees that everyone looks to set the tone? Particularly like or volunteers. Who are your super volunteers if it's a volunteer-based organization, or who are your highest performers? Who are the culture carriers? And getting those people to weigh in at certain points. I think at the onset, probably at the midway, and then ideally at the conclusion of your planning process. I found that to be really helpful because as I think I mentioned, there's nothing worse than you roll out something and you find out, oh, that's not actually feasible, or that culturally will not resonate. And so getting those culture carriers, those high performers to validate that, yes, this is the direction and people are going to understand it, I find to be very, very critical.
Thank you. That's helpful. As was the rest of the presentation.
Thank you.
Other comments or questions?
And I'll share this presentation with Lisa and Rachel to pass along to all of you in case helpful. And at the end of that presentation, I can also drop it in the chat, is my email and my LinkedIn. So I encourage you all to reach out if you have questions and to be in touch.
That would be great. This is you know, the first in our in-depth conversations that flows from the conversations that started at last year's conference and will flow into the conversations for next year's conference, understanding that we really are in a very tumultuous time. We don't know exactly what we need to be talking about at any given moment, but we will keep on sponsoring and supporting the work and figuring it out together. We like to say that, you know, YANA doesn't only stand for the Yale Alumni Nonprofit Alliance, it stands for You Are Not Alone as well, which, by the way, if you look that up online, can get you to some rather questionable sites. So don't, you know, don't make that mistake. But we are so appreciate. Akinyi was supposed to speak last year and she had a conflict at the last minute. And so we're just so grateful to you and for your wisdom and your participation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Want to say anything before we go?
Yeah, Akinyi, thank you, and thank everyone for showing up. Next, we're going to be doing this on a regular time every month for the remainder of the year until we have our next conference. I think next month we're doing kind of creating and managing a budget. Be really kind of hands-on. It's a very basic issues for everybody who's like new to this process versus, you know, have different perspectives on what a budget is and how you should do it. So please join us and let anyone else know who's going to be wrestling with that issue. Come on in. So thanks for being part of the YANA community.
Thank you so much, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.